commerce and industry in the Great Bay from the 1600s through the earliest 20th century. And when I include in the Great Bay, I also include the Lamprey and the Exeter rivers, because that's part of the Great Bay watershed. And it really contributed to the economic growth of the area from the time when the first Europeans came here up until today. So I got a few visuals here of the Gundalos and some of the mills, and we'll go from there. So when I think of the Great Bay, I also think of the Piscataqua River watershed. And today, I think most of us look at the Great Bay and appreciate it for any type of recreational activities like boating or fishing, or just enjoying the beauty of the bay itself. But also, if you think about it, the bay and the rivers around it are some type of a barrier for people to communicate, for people to cross over. It forms political barriers as long as physical barriers. And a few of the images I have here show a ferry boat around 1900. This is coming probably from Stratham going over towards Newfield, and the ferry boat has the horse and buggies on it. And then, of course, the bridge over there at Chapman's Landing was been there for several hundred years, and that was something that had to be designed and built to try to get people to travel around the bay a little bit easier. And of course, we have our new bridge there at the landing. But the first Europeans didn't consider the Great Bay and the Piscataqua River area a barrier for traveling. If you look at this map from the mid 1600s, there's no roads. So for the early Europeans, the Piscataqua River and the rivers going into the bay were like superhighways. They could go deep into the interior with very little effort. Very little effort. And what really helped to get them around in their small boats was the strong currents that we have here with the tidal drop of about 8 to 10 feet. The Great Bay and the rivers would empty out once a day, so you could drift down with the current, and then you could go back up through the current. So that was a real advantage to them to come through here and to exploit the natural resources that were available. So the first thing that they did after they tried to carve out some land for their farms is the first resource they were able to gather was fish. The Great Bay and the rivers going through here had very, very clean flowing water. They were able to harvest alewives, eels, bass, perch, smelts, even some salmon. The alewives or the river herring were pretty easy to catch. You could set up a weirs. There's a picture of a weirs here that is down in Newmarket. Somebody puts that up every spring. The Native Americans did that, and they were able to come down in the summer months and actually scoop up the herring at the base of the waterfalls. Here's a picture on the right from around probably the late 1800s of them still catching some alewives. They could also would get a lot of the other fish that were coming through here. Here's a picture of an 80-pound striped bass. The caption says it was caught by Albert West in 1910. It looks like the fish is just as big as Albert. And over here on the right, I kind of looked at this image here of the men fishing on the Swampscott River, and they were holding poles there to help them if they fell into the water. I wouldn't be all that comfortable going on the water on the ice if I felt that I had to have poles to keep me from drowning. Another resource that was harvested was the salt marsh hay. And this was a pretty important resource because they could harvest this marsh hay before they had a chance to clear the land and plant crops. And we have a picture here of a painting of our Gundalo with all the staddles in the background. That's what they call these piles of hay. This was probably more of a scene that you'd find down towards Rye and on the seacoast. But they were able to probably use small boats, small barges up in the Great Bay. The hay was very important to feed cattle. And also, before they could erect sawmills, they probably thatched their roofs with the salt marsh hay. This picture down on the bottom of the screen here was from Plymouth Plantation. And those houses were built around the same time as the early Europeans came into the Great Bay area. To harvest the hay, you would wait till the fall. Hopefully you would go on a low tide when it was easier to walk through there. You would cut it with a rake. Later on, they were pulling rakes with horses. You would pile it up and you would put it on these posts here called staddles, and you would wait there to dry the hay out before you could come and pull it away with either a small boat or pull it away in a wagon. You can see there's some people, looks like they're loading the hay onto a wagon coming from a small barge. And what they had to use is they used these bog shoes to put on the horses so they wouldn't sink in the mud. And there was different styles. You could see on the image on the right, the different styles from different parts of the area here. When they came up to at the end of the rivers, they found some waterfalls, they found rapids, and they were able to, they realized that because they were from England, the English were very knowledgeable of how to harness water power. English put in dams, they put in mills, and so they took that knowledge here and they put them on the Swampscott River and they put it on the Lamprey River. These are some of the signs that you'd see on the side of the road. The first mill was put in Exeter in 1640, and that was a grist mill. And over in Packers Falls, which is just outside of the town of Newmarket, they put in a sawmill in 1694. So the mills that they put in started off as being either a grist mill or a sawmill. This is some images from Plymouth Plantation. So there was a water wheel that would turn through some gears, these grinding stones. You can see the grinding stones here. The farmers would come into the mill and they would have their corn or any other grain that they wanted ground down. There wasn't a lot of cash around, so the mill owners would probably take a percentage of the grain that was milled. But also they put in sawmills. This is a picture of the Taylor Mill over in Nashua, and this is a restored early sawmill. And the sawmills at the time were not the circular mills that you're more familiar with today with the big round saw. They had an up and down saw, which was called a pit saw. And the name comes because before they were mechanizing the sawmills, you would have to dig a pit or a trench. You would put a log on going across it, and you would have a man in the pit and a man on top of the pit, and they would that's how they would saw the logs. It was pretty hard work, probably not very safe, and I'm sure it was very dirty. These sawmills were the source of the first water pollution in the bay. The sawdust went down into the river, followed up the river. It was harder for the fish to spawn, and of course the dams blocked the passage of the spawning of the fish. So here's some images here of some of the early mills. This happens to be a mill over here in the Oyster River. I misspelled that, but that's over in Durham Landing. There's a grist mill that was built there. The dam is still there, or a dam of probably been replaced several times. The grist mill is not there anymore. But over here on the Lamprey River, there was many mills along the river here. This happens to be from one of the websites of one of the Lamprey River associations. And I'm just going to briefly read what it says here. The real New Hampshire is a place of mills, factories, of powerful streams, harnessed in the service of industry, of working villages and cities. The hard work and the resourcefulness of New Hampshire people in the mill and factory made our state what it is. The same enterprise transformed our society. The bells of our mills taught an agricultural people to work by the clock rather than the sun. So what they're saying is the mills going in changed the way the people would normally structure their workday. Comes more like what we were expected to do today, work different shifts. So here's a video of or some images here of the Lamprey River watershed. And you could see it goes all the way down up to Nottingham, Deerfield. The tributaries are quite extensive. And if you can notice in the middle here, it's actually the beginning. There's actually Piscataqua River, and the Piscataqua Lake is part of the watershed. The image on the left-hand side shows you all the different mills that were one time put in the area. The first mill that you would encounter when you were going up the river, or the first dam, was called the Great Dam, and this was over here in Newmarket. And the Newmarket Manufacturing Company was established because of the falls. You can see the falls right here in the middle here. This was established around 1825, and it lasted up until about 1925. So at one time, they had 700 people working in the mills, and 700 people working in the different mills. And it was a textile mill. And you can see some other images over here. The image on the left-hand side is one of their spinning mills. This was one of the largest weaving rooms in the country at one time. And you can see how they had to work around the library, because the library was there about 30 years before the mill went in. Here's a picture of some of the women who had worked in the mills. And here's a couple other images here of the mill buildings itself. You could see this is on the right is what it looks like on the current picture of the mills. And on the left-hand side, you'll see it. This is probably in the 1850s or 60s. You can see the water power has probably been gradually being replaced by steam power, as we can see the smokestacks in the picture. And here's another image here of the mills today and what they were like probably in the late 1800s. Over here, where my cursor is, you can see there's a pile of coal, and we have some smokestacks. And then these shafts here on the buildings, these are not smokestacks, but these were actually, this is a shaft where they would house pulleys and belts and gears connected directly to a water turbine down in the basement where the water went through the building. And that's how they transferred power to all the different looms or all the different machinery that were in those buildings. So the next river, the next dam, you could go, if you went up the river, the Lamprey River. This is on Packers Falls. This is actually right outside of the town of Newmarket on Packers Falls Road. And this was a sawmill site in 1694. I don't really know when it stopped being used. But if you go there today, you can walk around and you can see the river is quite fast. It's flowing quite fast. And there's different structures that are still there. Over here on the right-hand side is probably one of the raceways where the water was directed to go over a water wheel. And up the street, not that far up the street on Wizwal Street in the town of Durham was the Wizwal Falls dam site. You can see that on the left-hand side was of the picture over here. You would have an early sawmill where the water was directed underneath the mill. And this was also a small village. A lot of these dam sites were not just one or two buildings, but a little village would form around it where they would have 10 or 15 or 20 people working in the mills. And since people didn't drive, horses were, not a lot of people had horses also, so you had to walk to work. So they tended to congregate around the early mills. Here's from one of the websites from the Lamprey River Association. It just shows the site itself. It was started in the 1850s as a sawmill and as a paper mill. They happened to make wallpaper there. It was quite an operation. They probably had to they probably had to get a lot of money to finance this. So it just wasn't a couple buildings. You can see on the bottom right-hand side, you could see the infrastructure that they had to put into. They had to build a power canal. They had to build a dam, and they had to maintain that. They probably had about 10 or 15 people that worked here, and that was considered a pretty a site of economic activity for the town of Dover at the time. The rest of Dover was very agricultural. If you were to go there today, you would see a dam, and you could see on the right they did put a fishway in. When the mill closed, the dam eventually in the early 1900s or 1920s, they did some electrical generation through the dam. But now the dam is owned by the town of Durham, and it's used as part of their water supply system. If you walked around the property, you could still see the remnants of what was there at one time. There's on the right, it looks like one of the power canals that was diverted. The water was diverted through the canals to some type of a turbine. The next mill that you would not too far away, 10 miles away or so, is the Wadley Falls in the town of Lee. There's a couple images here of the mill village. People walking across the dam on the right-hand side. Looks pretty dangerous to me. If you were to go there today, you would see the dam. Quite an extensive dam, covered the entire river. The dam was breached, so the water is rushing through it now. They had some type of a mill there from the 1600s up until the 1920s. There's several buildings around the area. So you can see the remnants of a small village. The picture on the bottom there is an old hotel from that era, from the early, late 1800s or so. Somebody tried to vandalize it 5 or 6 years ago, tried to burn it down, but the owner is restoring it, and it's now registered as a national landmark. Another interesting thing about the Lamprey River is Piscataqua Lake. In the 1700s, there was a couple dams and sawmills that were erected on the Dolph River and on the Piscataqua River, which was a tributary to the Lamprey River. The property was acquired in 1925 by the Newmarket Manufacturing Company, to provide some type of a water backup supply. Water supplies could be not very reliable in the late fall or in the summer and the late fall if you had a drought. So these mill owners would get water rights, and they would get dam sites up and down these rivers, and they can control the rivers the way they wanted to. There was no regulation like you would have today. Later on in the 1830s, the dikes and dams were added to make the lakes a little bit bigger. And when they weren't drawing down the lakes, drawing down the water from the two ponds, they gradually backed up and formed one big lake. After the company went out of business in the 1920s, for a while, the New England Electric Co-op ran some electrical generation plants there. They became inefficient. They closed them down, and now we have our Piscataqua Lake and our Piscataqua State Park. If we went up the up the bay and we went up the Lamprey up to the Swampscott Exeter River, you'll see that there was a dam and a mill built there in 1640. This was a grist mill, and the first textile mill was built in Exeter in 1830, using the power from the dam. This is a map of the Exeter Swampscott River system, and you can see that's quite extensive also. It goes all the way over to Chester. And these sites here were the different mills and dams that were put on the river itself. Here's a list of all the mills on the Exeter River from 1639 to 1900. I didn't bother to go around and counting all the different mills, but if you can look and go down through this, they're mostly sawmills, few paper mills, but there's a mill here that I thought was pretty interesting here. This is a powder mill. This was established in 1776 by a Colonel Hobart, and a powder mill was a mill that would make gunpowder, or black powder as they called it. You would take saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, and you would grind it up to be very, very fine, and you could use it to, it would explode. So you would use it in your cannons or in your guns at the guns. And during the beginning of the Revolution, when there was the siege of Boston, there was a real shortage of gunpowder, like there was for the rest of the Revolution. So it was said that George Washington came up to Exeter and inspected the powder mill in Exeter, and to make sure that the quality of the gunpowder would be acceptable, and it was. So this mill here did send some powder down to the troops down around Boston during the siege of Boston. You can see there's mostly the mills here are sawmills, some grist mills. Later on, you can see some of the cotton mill or a woolen mill or some type of a textile mill was built, but it was really started off mostly sawmills, because the forest in this area were just very, very vast, just vast amounts of forest land, and that's what the colonists came for. Is they came for the lumber in the woods. So here's a couple images of some of the mills here along the Exeter River. This is in Exeter by the String Bridge, and this is some of the along the String Bridge, which is and some of the earlier mills were in Exeter were the textile mills. The Exeter Manufacturing Company was started around the 1820s for a to produce textiles, and the mill kept on expanding as their business got better and the technology improved. You can see there's some smokestacks here, so they probably weren't dependent upon water power as much as they at this time. They were probably going with steam power, and then later on they converted over to electricity. Here's a few more images here along the Exeter River. The picture on the right would be collecting logs over in Fremont. And here's a few more images of mills. There's a couple dams on the river still. The one here in Piscataqua Falls is still there. There's several dams there. There was some sawmills in the area at one time. Then we had a few more mills going up the river through Chester. Here's an interesting map here about the exports of wood products coming from New England in the 1600s. You can see that we had mast logs, but we had quite a bit of white oak staves that were sent over to Europe and some down into the Caribbean. A stave is a section of a barrel. The image on the right would be some staves that were used in a wine barrel. The product that would have been exported from the area would be more of it would remind you more of like a 1x6 piece of finished wood you would get down at Home Depot. The wood would be exported to the different cooperages, and a cooper was a very skilled individual who could put together these barrels or these kegs. Think of this as the packaging industry of the time. There was no cardboard, there was no plastic. Everything had to be shipped in some type of a barrel. In Fremont, on the river, there was a cooperage called Spalding and Frost. It was started in the 1700s by several people from Rochester, and they ran the cooperage up until the 1970s. The Spalding family owned and operated this. Several of the members of the Spalding family ended up getting into politics and were governors of New Hampshire. The Spalding Turnpike and Spalding High School in Rochester is named after the Spalding family. The cooperage closed down in the 1970s. Then some other people bought it, and they were going to try to revive the company and make small barrels for decorating and home decorating and for gifts and things of that nature. They never really quite made it, and the factory did close. I remember going to the factory when it was closed. It was quite extensive, quite interesting. It's been torn down now, and they're trying to make it into an industrial park. So another aspect of this lumber trade was the mast trade. The British Navy and the British merchant service needed vast amounts of lumber for their mast and for their spars. England cut down all their trees. They didn't have any trees left for this purpose. Their supply of mast logs would come from Finland or Russia, and that was pretty unreliable. As time went on, there was wars, there was all types of different conflicts out there, so they couldn't depend upon that. that source of material. So when the English settled North America, they found vast stands of these tall white pine trees. This is a little bit of an edict put out by the Massachusetts Bay Company in Massachusetts Bay government in 1619. And it talked about furnishing masts for the Royal Navy. And they said all trees of a diameter of 24 inches was going to be reserved for the King's Navy. And under the severe penalty of 100 pounds, anybody who was violating that would be in trouble, and they would be fined, or other consequences would come of they would be fined pretty heavily. Here's a picture of some of the what these eastern white pines would look like. I took these pictures over in Bradford. There's a stand of white pine trees that have been preserved. You can see the trees could be up to 200 feet tall. They could be up to 4 feet in diameter. And the forests back then were not the forest like you would see today, with a lot of the underbrush and hard to walk through. These trees had a canopy that would block out the sun, so you could actually walk through the forest quite easily. So to try to preserve these trees for the King's Navy, they had King's agents that were in charge of going around and identifying these types of trees and putting their mark on it. This would be, they called it the King's Broad Arrow, and you could see here's a depiction of people putting the broad arrow on the trees. So when it was time to harvest the trees, they would prepare the ground where the tree was going to fall with some type of a bedding. These would be probably a lot of branches, something soft, because when you cut the tree down, you didn't want it to fall down and break or split apart, then it would be ruined as a mast tree. So here's a couple images of them cutting a tree. Hopefully the sawyers would land the tree on their targets. Then the tree would be, or the log would be trimmed, and it would be transported to one of the rivers, and it would go down what they call a mast road. And a mast road, you find them in many of the towns around here. The mast road was a road that was fairly level. You couldn't have too many steep hills because you couldn't pull it up the hills, or you couldn't stop up the hills, or actually it would be pretty dangerous coming down a hill. And if it went through a town or a village, you wanted to make sure there was enough room so it could pivot down the road. It got down to the side of the river, which is called a mast landing or a mast yard. This was all done in the wintertime, so they would sometimes just put it on the ice and wait for the springtime to come, or they would keep it in a yard by the side of the river where they might do some trimming of the log until it was until they could get it down to the seaport. They would raft them up and take them down to a port on the Piscataqua River in Elliott. There's a section of the river called the Mast Cove, where they would marshal up these, or gather up these logs. And then in Newcastle, there was another place where the logs could be stored. If you were to go from Portsmouth down through Newcastle across the causeway, on your right-hand side, you can see there's a little cove in there that doesn't the water is pretty calm. Several times a year, these mast ships would come up into the port. The logs would be loaded through the stern, and when it was ready to sail, the door would be caulked up and sealed up, and they would sail away to England. Here's a picture here. This is actually a picture of a model of one of the mast ships. Up in Falmouth, Maine, there's a museum called the Tate House, and the person who owned that house was actually an agent of the king, agent for the king to gather up the mast trade, the masts, and in charge of the mast trade there. And they have a table with models of the different ships. Now, these mast ships were usually pretty well armed because the cargo is very, very valuable. And it was also probably considered a strategic war material, we would call that today. And there was always the danger of the French or even the Spanish capturing these ships. So it was important that they would get through across to England. Now, the person who was in charge of the mast trade, his title was Surveyor General of the King's Woods. And he was appointed by the officials in England. And it just so happened that the surveyor of the King's Woods in the Portsmouth area was our royal governor, Benning Wentworth. And he was the governor here. He was our first royal governor, and he served for 23 years in the mid-1700s. Benning Wentworth became fabulously wealthy through the mast trade. His whole family became very, very wealthy. You can see his house over here on Little Harbor Road in Portsmouth. Now, Benning, he kind of played fast and loose with the rules. He was also, being the royal governor, he also was able to sign the charters for many of the towns in New Hampshire over that period of time. And he made a deal sometimes where he would, for helping to charter a town, he would be given a certain amount of land in the town. And the land was always considered, they called it the best land. And in his case, the best land had the best trees. So he, like I said, he became fabulously wealthy, and his entire family became very wealthy from the mast trade. Now, this is a picture of the Wentworth Gardner house in Portsmouth. And Benning's brother, Mark Hunting Wentworth, had this house built. The history books say that his wife had the house built, but it was built as a wedding gift for his son, Thomas Wentworth. And if anybody has a chance to go through the house or hasn't been through the house, it's absolutely been restored. It's actually, I think, one of the nicest houses in Portsmouth for that time frame. And over on the right-hand side, where I have the picture above the fireplace, this is one piece of wood. It's 4 feet wide. So you can see how big these trees were. Now, after a while, the people in England, Benning's supporters, the Privy Council, they were getting a little tired of him, of cheating on the mast trade, not enforcing the rules. Plus, if you're in office for 23 years, you're going to make some enemies. So Benning was told to retire, and his nephew, John Wentworth, was appointed to be the royal governor. And John was he was more of a stickler for enforcing the mast trade, and that kind of upset a lot of people because there was some riots in Portsmouth. I mean, there was several different riots, one in Fremont, where people would threaten the agents who were inspecting the trees, and there were in Wentworth, actually, a lot of his favorability ratings went down because of that. There's a little notice here from 1750 about people cutting down the trees or taking the trees in the Connecticut River Valley. And this is from Benning Wentworth putting out an edict saying they were going to enforce the laws, and anybody who was cutting down those trees and using it for different purposes, they would be punished. If you were to go through some of the older houses in Portsmouth, you might look on the floorboards and you might see them about 20, 22, 23 inches wide. And that's because anything larger than that had to go for a mast tree. But if you would go up in the attics, or you would go on the second floor, sometimes you would see boards that were much wider, because the inspectors always didn't go into the second floor of the houses. So there was a lot of people were cheating on that. A lot of people were very upset with that type of a ruling, because it deprived a lot of the locals a lot of their money. And in 1734, this is the mast tree riot in Fremont. It says here that the local citizens assembled, discharged their firearms, and convinced Dunbar, and he was the Surveyor General, or the agent of the Surveyor General, to leave. They ended up hiding out in a tavern, but nothing ever really came of that after. This is some statistics here about the amount of trees and lumber that were exported from Portsmouth. You can see here in 1750 and then 1759, there was 800 mast trees sent from Portsmouth. And of course, it goes down in 1772, 1775. That's when the revolution started. John Wentworth, our second royal governor and our last royal governor, was politely asked to leave his mansion when they put a cannon in the front door. And his mansion is on Pleasant Street. It's now Wentworth Senior Living. Wentworth Senior Living building there now. And so after the revolution, after Wentworth was gone, then people started just taking the mast and cutting the trees down anytime they wanted, and using the mast for their own purposes. There's another display here of the lumber that was shipped out of the New England ports in 1768, and you could see Portsmouth was by far the largest exporter of lumber. It was known as the lumber port. Another industry that developed from the forest here was shipbuilding. In the beginning, lumber was shipped out to England and down to the Caribbean, and people would build their ships there. It didn't take them too long to figure out it was much more efficient to bring over skilled workers over here into North America. Portsmouth became a big shipbuilding port down in Badger's Island and in parts of Portsmouth. But the shipbuilding industry went up into the Great Bay, went up the different rivers. or I shouldn't say that they went up the Piscataqua. They went up even up the Salmon Falls. There were shipyards, but we had shipyards here in the Great Bay, on the Swampscott River, and in Dover. I mean in Durham. These little sketches here are from a book I have about shipbuilding on the Kennebuck River. They had the same similar rivers, small rivers, and they had a pretty thriving shipbuilding industry also. You can see the shipyards there were pretty basic. Everything was built out in the open, but it was a little manufacturing facility or a little village built around the shipyards. They had to have a sawmill. They had to have different facilities to form the wood and build the ship itself. But up here in the rivers, they just couldn't finish off put the rigging on the ships here. The rivers were just too small and too shallow. So they would partially build the boat, or they would probably have the boat completed, and they would, without the rigging, they would put rafts underneath them, or maybe hogshead, which were large barrels, to try to give it some more buoyancy. And then they would tow it down the river, and they would pull the different rigging with it. There's another sketch from that book on the Kennebuck River. They would bring it down to Portsmouth, and they would go to these small warehouses, these small lofts. This happens to be a picture of Sheaf's Warehouse, which is down in Prescott Park. And that's where the rigging, and that's where the boats would be finished off. Here's a painting of the Durham town landing. Right now, there's nothing in the landing itself. This is, if you go over the Route 108 bridge and you look over to your right down into the Oyster River, this was one time the center of a lot of commercial activity. You can see there's a couple boats being built here. Now, this is a painting, so some of the, it's not going to be 100% accurate, but this gives you an idea of a shipbuilding facility right here in the Oyster River. Then you would have in Newfield, they had a shipyard. You can see there's a sketch here from 1837 of a shipyard down here on the river, and that's where the town landing is today. And then, of course, up in Exeter, they did quite a bit of shipbuilding. Over here, where I have marked off, is where the shipyard was, and this is the Swayze Parkway today. The picture on the right-hand side is the last ship that was launched in Exeter. This is the Merrill. And from 1784 to 1902, the customs records in Portsmouth states that there's 51 ships that were built in Exeter at the time. Now, before 1784, there wasn't any customs records, so there was probably many more ships that were built right here in Exeter. Another industry that was along on the Swampscott River was the Swampscott Machine Company in Newfield. It's kind of interesting here on the right-hand side. This looks like it's an advertisement, how they spelled Swampscott. They used a W instead of the Q. They made a lot of castings, a lot of iron parts that they could sell to the different textile mills in the area, and also they built steam engines. Another industry that was in the Great Bay area and the Piscataqua area are brickyards. There was many brickyards in the area. We had a rich layer of clay. They would take the clay and mix it up with straw or whatever they used to do, and they used to, and they would have to bake the bricks in a kiln. And here's some pictures of the Gundalos carrying bricks on the right and firewood on the left-hand side. These brickyards consumed vast amounts of wood, and it didn't have to be high quality wood like you would have for your lumber or your making your barrel staves. So whatever was left of the forest at the time were probably cut down for in the brick trade. Now there was a big market for bricks because we were building the mills up in Dover, up in Biddeford, Maine, and also I read accounts where some of the Piscataqua River bricks were shipped down to Boston when they were filling in the Great Bay and they were building the houses along Commonwealth and Avenue and Beacon Street. So I had this title here, Ports of the Piscataqua. There was a book written about Ports of the Piscataqua, and the reason they called it Ports of the Piscataqua is because you could take schooners all the way into Newmarket. You could take it all the way up into Exeter. They also went up to Dover, and you didn't have to transfer your cargo down into Boston. You could go right up into these into where the factories were. And here's a postcard here around 1900 of schooners in Newmarket. It's kind of hard to believe that they could get in there today. Here's another picture of some schooners in Exeter itself. A few more pictures of schooners in Exeter. And then here's a couple schooners here. One's being towed up to Swampscott River, and the one on the right actually is going up the Lamprey River into Newmarket. Another boat that was in the river. I think most of us are familiar with the Gundalos. The first Gundalos were built by the farmers in the 1600s, 1700s. They were basically small rafts or barges put together to last maybe a couple years to carry their cattle or their firewood across the rivers, across the bays. And as the industry in the area developed, the boats got more sophisticated and were larger, more sophisticated, and carry heavier cargo. This is a sketch of the Fanny M, which is captained by Edward Adams out of Durham Point. And this is the last Gundalo that was operating in the Great Bay area. Gundalos were perfect for the Great Bay. It had a shallow draft of about 2.5 feet. If you were going to unload cargo where there wasn't a port, you would just pull up on the banks of the river. You would put some planks off the front of it, and then you would just unload your cargo. All your cargo was carried on deck. The original Gundalos did not have any sails. You would have these long oars called sweeps that would take you into the current, and then you would depend upon the current to carry you up and down the river. Later on, they put sails on them. There was the first sails were probably a square rig sail, and then they came up with this lateen rigging, which allowed the sail or the spar to pivot, and that was because they were starting to put bridges across over there by Hilton's Point. They were putting in some railroad bridges and different bridges. And for the Gundalos to go underneath the bridges, you would drop the sail and you would shoot the bridges. And then you could get through the bridge, you could put your sail back up. Here's some images of Gundalos on the river here. in Newmarket, and in different, one over on the right-hand corner in the top is in Newmarket. The one on the left-hand corner is on the bottom is over there in Durham. You can see the General Sullivan House in the background. We have a tugboat here, but you notice that there's an awful lot of cordwood here, probably going to some of the brick kilns. Here's a picture of Captain Edward Adams on the right-hand side. This is the last captain of an active gundalo in the Great Bay. And there's a picture of him, a picture over on the right of the Fanny M in front of his house over there in Adams Point. Adams Point now is the site of the Jackson Laboratories from the University of New Hampshire. Over the 200 and so years, there was probably hundreds, if not thousands, of gundalos going through the Great Bay and down the Piscataqua River. Here's some more images here of the river traffic. This is going through the old bridge there at Chapman's Landing, going between Newfields and Stratham. There's a coal barge going here, and there's a tugboat also. When did this all end? Well, the mills along the Lamprey River and the Exeter River were very small. They were inefficient. They were mostly sawmills. Trees were being cut down. There wasn't a lot left. And the industry that was developing was more of a high value type of a product, mostly textiles. And so the types of products being shipped out were probably had to get there at a certain time. And the river traffic was just too slow and unreliable. But one of the reasons is that the river started silting in. We can see here on the left, there's a little map here of clear cutting in the Piscataqua River Basin between 1700 and 1750. And you could just see between, 10 miles or so, everything was clear cut. The first clear cutting in North America happened to be around the Great Bay Area. It started by cutting trees for lumber, lumber for ships, lumber for construction, and then we had our mast trade, and then they were cutting trees down for barrel staves, dimensional lumber, and then of course the brick kilns probably took out most of the other trees. I've heard of people saying you could get on top of the Stratham Hill, where Stratham Hill Park is today, and you look around and you wouldn't see one tree. A little bit of an exaggeration, but it was probably pretty much true. So they tried to dredge the river. Going up to the Swampscott River wasn't that easy. Especially when you had to negotiate through the landing at Chapman's Landing, the bridge there, going through Chapman's Landing. You can see here they are dredging up the river. That was probably taken around 1910. That picture. But really, what happened, what really killed the river trade was the railroads. The railroads could take the railroad started coming up through the area here in the 1840s, probably on the same route as we have today, going through Exeter, through Newfields, Newmarket, up to Durham, Dover, and you would ship your products down to the larger ports like Boston, or the railroads would go west. The country was growing. It was growing to the west. There was a big demand for goods. and the railroads follow them. So the river traffic and the traffic on the bay just dried up. It wasn't efficient at all. What is the legacy that we have from this commerce and this trade? Well, first of all, we have our mill buildings. You could see the ones in Dover and Newmarket. They have been converted over to living spaces, apartments, condominiums. In Newmarket, they restored the mills not only for apartments, but also for some commercial space. Then, of course, we have our Gundalo, and which continues the tradition of sailing on the river. And as we know, their mission is to educate the public about the maritime history of the Piscataqua region, and also to discuss and also to educate people on the ecology of the Great Bay and how important it is to maintain it. And also we have our Mast Roads. And actually in Lee, we have a Mastway school. If you were to go on Google Maps and put on Mast Road, you would probably find 4 or 5 different towns that have Mast Roads. And there's even a Mast Row in Manchester. And of course, we also have our dams. And we have Pawtuckaway State Park, or Lake Pawtuckaway from that. So here's some images of dams. There's been a move now to remove dams along the rivers. Some of the reasons for removing the dams would be they would block the passage of fish during their spawning season. They could cause flooding upriver, especially in Exeter. In about 10 years ago, they had a period of 2 or 3 years where they had a lot of rain, and a lot of flooding was upriver. If you were to go to downtown Exeter, you would see the Sea Dog pub, which used to be the old Loaf and Ladle. That got flooded out several years in a row, which caused one of the reasons why the Loaf and Ladle had to close. There's about 300 dams in New Hampshire. A lot of them are mill dams put in the 17 and 1800s. A lot of them are in disrepair. So people were thinking about, well, if the dams needed to have extensive work, a lot of cost, maybe we should tear it down. So people were decided that, maybe that's the way to go. Other people want to keep the dams because it's, good for recreation, good kayaking, fishing. Property values could be depressed if the dam was gone, and all of a sudden your nice waterfront property could have been more of a stream. And of course, it's heritage. This is the reason why the towns were established, is because of the dams. So the dam on the right is the dam in Newmarket. 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, the dam needed to be worked on. They needed extensive work because it was ready to, or it could have failed. So the town decided that they wanted to keep the dam, and they expended money to repair the dam. The town of Exeter took a different attitude. They decided to remove the dam. And they actually, besides just removing the dam, they sculpted the riverbed so that it would be more of a natural river course, so that the alewives could start to begin to migrate up the river. Their fish ladder that they had there was not very effective at the time. But what they did is, over here on the right, this is the library here, they kept some of the old mill works here. You can see there's a penstock would be here. There's some gears here to lower, to monitor the water. And so they try to keep some of their heritage and their legacy of the dam on the river to preserve that. And over here on the left in the corner is the dam they have in Durham. Earlier or last year, the selectmen voted to remove the dam. They had an awful lot of feedback from or pushback from some of the residents. So they tabled that, and it's going to go to a vote, I believe, in the elections this spring. So we'll see what happens, what the town decides to do with their dam. So that's just about it. My time is up. Does anybody have any questions or any comments?
I haven't gotten any questions in the chat yet, Dave. You did have a pretty comprehensive talk, so maybe people had questions but got them answered. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to type them into the chat.
Nope.
Great. No, just a thank you. Very informative talk. So I guess if no one has questions, we'll go ahead and end it there. We ran a little over, so I want to make sure I'm respecting everybody's time. But like I said, it is recorded and it will go up on YouTube in the near future. So if you want to rewatch it, you know, you can find it on our YouTube channel. Okay. Any last things to add, David?
No, I just thank everybody for listening to that. And I hope when I go to different types of people, when I see different types of things, I drive around, I always ask myself, why is that there? So I'm very curious of that. So I tried to answer a lot of my own questions by putting it into this presentation. So I hope other people got the same idea on that. So, okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great day and stay warm.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Bye-bye.